Good evening. After you mark that, turn to the book of James. We're going to continue our series looking at some of the high points of the book of James. As you're turning there, I will tell you that Zane and I are barely surviving. We are on our own for 2 weeks. Some of you have asked about Libby and Zoe and Keely. Keely is spending 2 weeks at Harding, and so rather than drive home and then back to go get her, they stayed in my hometown, which is about an hour and a half away, and my wife took care of my mother's estate and selling some items so I wouldn't have to be away from you, and I appreciate her doing that very much. And they'll be home Friday, so I'm not to the point where I'm so desperate as I need you to cook me a casserole, but it may get to that point, and I'll let you know. You know, the public opinion pollster George Barna polled a cross-section of Americans one time, and he asked them, if you could ask God one question and you knew he would give you an answer, what would that question be? And the answer was a resounding that they would ask, why is there so much suffering in the world? I've talked to a lot of people who have said, you know, I can't wait until I get to heaven because I'm going to ask God why there's so much pain and suffering in the world. And of course, my response is, I don't think you're going to care once you get there. I think that's going to be the last thing on your mind. But we do ask why. We do wonder why. We wonder why that good person has to deal with cancer. We wonder why that righteous person who is at church every time the doors are open, that is always serving, always giving, why they're suffering so terribly from a dreaded disease. We wonder why. Where is the justice? Where is the fairness? Of course, as I've said before, nobody guaranteed that life is fair. God certainly did it, and Jesus certainly didn't. So if we're expecting fairness in life, we're going to be sorely disappointed to begin with. So maybe that's the first thing we need to start with. Don't expect life to be fair because it's not going to be. But so many times we ask the wrong question. You've heard me say before, we ask why when we should be asking how. How can I get through this with God on my side? Some things that we need to remember when it comes to suffering. First and foremost, some things that we need to get out of the way is, number one, God gave us free will, and number two, God is no respecter of persons. So we have to understand that because God gave us free will and because He gave us this wonderful free gift, some people use that gift in ways that is not righteous, that is wicked or evil, and therefore cause a lot of turmoil and tribulation in people's lives. Everyone that was on board those jets that flew into the World Trade Center towers on 9/11, all of them had free will, including the terrorists. And they exercised their free will in a very wicked way, killing thousands of people ultimately. Free will is guaranteed to us by our Savior, by God, and He is not going to step in because He's not a respecter of persons and take that choice away from us. And so we have to understand that from the very beginning. And there's some other things that we need to understand from suffering as we lay the groundwork. First of all, some suffering is our own fault. We can't blame God for things that we do and the suffering that we cause ourselves. I mean, a person who decides to drink and get behind the wheel of a vehicle and crashes that vehicle is somebody that's to be held responsible for that decision. That's not God's fault. There are so many people that I've talked to who are sitting in a prison cell when I've done jail ministry that have tried to blame God for their certain situation or have tried to credit God with landing them there so that they can be a better person. It's because of your own choices. That's why you're there. Can God help you through adverse circumstances even if you created those adverse circumstances? Yes, I believe He can. But we don't need to blame God for things that we are solely responsible of. Some suffering is totally and completely our fault. Also, some suffering is generational. Some suffering we didn't have a hand in creating, and yet we are having to endure the consequences of, whether it be past governmental decisions and legislation. You see a lot of advertisements on television right now for mesothelioma, people who have contracted a specific form of lung cancer from asbestos. We didn't know all the dangers of asbestos many years ago. Now we're finding those out, and so many people are dealing with the effects of that, or lead paint poisoning, Adam and Eve, whatever it is. We live in a fallen world, and we deal with the consequences. Even though we didn't partake of that fruit from the forbidden tree, we still deal with the consequences of the two that did. And there are some things that we had no control over, but we still pay the price for. Some suffering is the result of natural laws that have been in place since the very beginning of time. And as we said, God is no respecter of persons, so He's not going to step in if you're falling from a tall building and suspend the law of gravity so as to save you. These laws have been in place since the beginning of time, and they're not suspended for each and every person. God is not a God of chaos. And you can imagine the chaos that would ensue if God stepped in and suspended those laws every time something like that happened. We also know that some suffering is beneficial. We don't always like to talk about that. We don't always see suffering as being beneficial. But there are times when suffering can be very beneficial. And I would suggest to you many times, most times, suffering can be very beneficial. It depends on our attitude or our perspective. Now, I'm not suggesting that we all need to look at suffering with great joy and just say, bring it on. I'm not suggesting that whatever trial that you're going through, that you should put on a smile because it's really a good thing. Suffering's tough. It's hard, and I'm not trying to make light of that in any way. And I'm certainly not suggesting that you should ever ask questions or you should ever wonder why, because that's only natural. But we cannot deny the fact that some suffering can be beneficial. The person who struggles with chest pains and goes to the doctor and finds out that they have some blockages, that they were on the brink of a heart attack, certainly that suffering, that pain was beneficial. Some of you here have had pain and have endured pain, and it signaled something greater in your life, something that was detrimental to your health. That was a good thing. That was beneficial. But as we're going to see in a minute, there are things far beyond just these things that can benefit from suffering. And finally, we need to understand that some suffering is unexplainable. Some suffering we're never going to understand. With our finite minds, we're not going to understand the suffering that we have to endure sometimes. Job didn't. We have the benefit of reading about Job after the fact. But while Job was going through what he was going through, he didn't realize why he was having to endure this. It was unexplainable to him. He couldn't fathom why God had put this on his shoulders. And there are some things that we will never completely and totally understand, and we need to chalk it up to God and leave it at that. Even though we have questions, we'll never truly wrap our minds around it. But I believe that oftentimes our struggle with suffering comes from an inability, perhaps, to see the big picture. Let me ask you something. How strange would it be for you to listen to James or one of our elders come up here and say, we want to pray for so-and-so who is sick and in the hospital. We want to pray that they die, and we want you to join us in that prayer. Please pray for their death to come soon. We don't ever pray that. But do we not, as Christians, send a mixed message sometimes by not praying that? What do we always pray for? That somebody gets better, right? Why do we do that? Well, there's a few reasons. Number one, we're selfish. And I don't mean that in a derogatory manner. I mean, we just are. I mean, if my wife, my daughters, my son was sick and in the hospital, I would pray for a miracle, anything, to get them well because I want them around. I love them. I want to see them grow. I want to see them mature. I want to be around them as long as I possibly can. We want to hang on to that, right? And certainly that is natural. So there is a selfishness involved there too. But another reason we don't pray for that is because we've invested so much in this life, right? We talk about heaven. We even say that we look forward to heaven. We sing about heaven. But we're a little bipolar about heaven, aren't we? We want to go there, but we don't want to go anytime soon. We want to cling to this life as much as possible for as long as possible. And don't we send a bit of a mixed message? You remember when Roy Scott was going through his ordeal and we didn't think he was going to make it? One of our elders here a few years ago, and if you don't know about that, ask Royce. He'd be glad to tell you all about it. But Royce was literally on his deathbed. We didn't think he was going to pull out of it. And so I requested that the elders do a prayer service that Sunday morning. As it happened Saturday night, I didn't feel comfortable going along with the normal sermon that I had prepared. And so we had a prayer service. And we prayed for Royce to get better, to pull through, and he did. Do I believe God answers prayer? Absolutely. But one of our elders at the time, Ken Dozier, got up here, and if you'll remember, he said, I feel a little uncomfortable about leading this prayer because if heaven is better and Royce is ready to go, then why are we trying to keep him here? And I think a lot of other people were thinking that, but we don't really know how to solve that riddle in our minds, do we? We're torn between two worlds. We want to keep them here and we want to stay here, but at the same time, we do want to end up in heaven. But if heaven is so much better than here, if heaven is the ultimate home for us, an eternity of bliss and peace and tranquility and comfort of worshiping God and being with God for all eternity, if that's what heaven is, why do we cling so much to this life? Why are we not so willing to go there? I think we know the answer to some degree, but I think it boils down to a lack of being able to see the big picture. Folks, we have invested everything in this life, haven't we? We are so tied to this world that we can't see the next. But James, in James chapter 1, says these words. He says, "Consider it pure joy, my brethren, when you endure various trials." Surely he's speaking sarcastically here, right? Surely he's joking about this. Consider it all joy? What are you talking about, James? But yet throughout the New Testament, we see a very different perspective on suffering than what we adhere to in this world, right? You ever noticed how the New Testament writers, particularly Paul and James and Peter, how they looked at suffering? You ever notice their attitude and their perspective? Many years ago, when I first preached on the subject of suffering, I decided, as a young preacher just starting out, I decided this year I'm going to test myself. I'm going to preach on topics that I know nothing about, and I'm going to really stretch myself. And that was probably a dumb idea at the time, but it really helped me to grow as well. And one of those topics was suffering. And I started examining suffering because, I'll be honest with you, I still have a lot of those same questions. But as I looked at it and I looked through the New Testament, you see people who had a very different attitude towards suffering. And it doesn't take you long to notice that they have a perspective that is really opposite of the way we view suffering in our world today. James says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." You see, what we see from a New Testament perspective is that these people didn't invest everything in this life, but rather they saw this life as a training ground for the next. They saw this life as preparation for going home. Now, in large part, we don't view life as that way. We don't see life in those terms. Typically, we see this life as, make a lot of money, do the best you can to set yourself up for retirement, enjoy all the blessings around you, and that's really the wholeness of our existence. Maybe even within the church a lot of times. But James is saying, consider it all joy, because when you have your faith tested through the various trials that you endure, it's only going to help you to prepare for the next life. How? How does it do that? Well, one way is that it helps you realize that there is a life beyond this one. I think any of you here that have gone through suffering, and I've got some people in mind, any of you in here that have gone through some terrible times in your life, some difficult suffering, you know, because you have told me, that you drew closer to God during those times. Doesn't mean that you didn't have your times of weeping and wailing and questioning, but you got closer to God during those times. It's through suffering that we can draw closer to God. It's through suffering that we realize that this life isn't all that there is, that we are born with an expiration date, that it's going to come due, maybe sooner than we wanted it to. It's through suffering that we realize that this world is not our home, we're just passing through, that there's something far greater awaiting us. It's through suffering that we realize that there's something better, and we cling to hope. I know of a lot of folks that have dealt with terrible suffering in their lives, and oddly, they said it refocused them, that it made them more aware of their need for God, and they found great solace in that. They found great comfort in that. They said there's nothing like being at a point in your life where you realize that you truly have nothing but God. That all of this is going to pass away, and that becomes a reality, and all you have truly in the end is God. Certainly that's beneficial, right? It's just hard for us to see that. An untested faith is a weak faith. We should want our faith to be tested. James is not saying that all trials are joyous, but rather we can rejoice in the midst of them, knowing what could possibly be produced if we allow God to work. Trials provide an opportunity to prove or test the genuineness of our faith. James uses the word testing. In the Greek, it's dokimos, which means the genuine element of one's faith. The word is also used to describe the difference between pure gold that has been processed for coinage and impure gold that is yet to have the dross or impurities removed. In other words, trials can serve to refine our faith. They can function as the furnace through which the Christian passes and thus demonstrates the genuineness of their faith. When you go through a trial, you'll either draw closer to God or you'll push further away. And of course, the hope is, and what God would hope is that you would use your free will to draw closer to Him. There's no question that first century Christians viewed suffering differently than many people today. To hear words like rejoice, glory, and fellowship associated with suffering seems totally oxymoronic to us. So contradictory, and yet that's what we read over and over again. Let me share some passages with you. 1 Peter 4:13, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when His glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. Philippians 3:10, that I may know Him and the power of His resurrection and the fellowship of His sufferings, being conformed to His death. Acts 5:41 states that after the apostles were flogged for preaching in the name of Jesus, they were released and told not to speak in His name again. Then it says that they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for His name. And then Galatians 6:17, Paul writes, from now on, let no one cause trouble for me, for I bear on my body the brand marks of Jesus. People like Paul and others viewed suffering very differently because they viewed life differently. Paul was ready to go home. Many of these first century Christians were sky watchers. They were ready to go home or they were ready for Jesus' return. Either way, they were just ready to go. Are we ready to go? Do we feel comfortable that if we were to take on some terrible disease tomorrow, if the doctor tells us tomorrow it's cancer and there's nothing we can do? Certainly our initial reaction, we can probably guess, is going to be devastation. But after that initial reaction and that initial devastation, do we feel confident? Do we feel comfortable with the life that we have lived? That we're able to let it go because it's prepared us well for our eternal home? Maybe you don't get the devastating diagnosis. Perhaps you're blindsided with something. Hit by a car, drunk driver crosses the center line, you don't have much time to think about it. Have you invested everything in this life without much thought into eternity, or would you feel comfortable that if your life ended today, that you'd be ready? You know, I think those are questions we all need to ask ourselves. Are we eternally focused, or are we earthly driven? Are we people that are looking forward to our eternal home and every day preparing for it? Or are we a people that are so consumed with this life that we can't see the next? Paul assures Christians that the eternal reward which God has prepared for them is far greater than any sufferings that they have to endure in this life. You want to boost in Christian confidence? Read Romans chapter 8 sometime. The opportunity the other day to go and visit a sweet lady in the hospital. She called up to the church building, or somebody did, and said that she had requested that the preacher come by and visit her. I didn't know the lady beforehand. Come to find out, she knew Brenda Kiefer. And she thought Brenda Kiefer was the sweetest thing to ever walk the earth, and we know she is, so I didn't argue with her. But she said, you know, as sweet as Brenda Kiefer is, she must have a great church family, and I want to meet her church family. I want to meet her preacher. And so I sent the email on to the elders, and I had a chance to go up there and talk with her. Her name was Miss Betty. Miss Betty has been diagnosed with terminal cancer and apparently has several tumors. She is advanced in years. I don't know quite how old she is. She's had a rough life. And as I went in to talk with her, she was saying how much she wants God in her life. In essence, she said, I've pretty much wasted my existence, and I know that I don't have much more time left. I want to get out of here. I want to be baptized. I want to worship at Oldham Lane. I want to do the things that I haven't been doing. And as we sat there and talked some more, I said, Miss Betty, would you like me to read to you? Do you have a favorite scripture? And she said, I like the 23rd Psalm. So I pulled out the 23rd Psalm, and we read it. I read it, and she quoted it as I was reading it. And I told her, I said, Miss Betty, people often quote this psalm at funerals. This is not a psalm of death. This is a psalm of life. And I said, you have an opportunity to live. Even though you're dying, you have an opportunity to live. And I want to help you realize that opportunity to have that hope. I talked with one of the nurses. I said, can we get her baptized here in the hospital if she doesn't get out? And she said, I will check on that. I will do my best. But she said, I think she's going to get out of here. I think she will have some life left to live. And so one of these days, she's going to come through those doors, and I'm going to introduce you to her, and I want you to love on her. Here is a woman who has come to the realization that all this life is fleeting, and it really doesn't matter. It took her a while to get there, but she's come to that realization. I hope we all come to that realization. I hope we understand that whatever trials or suffering we may endure, it doesn't compare to the eternal home that awaits us. In Romans 5:3, Paul writes, and not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. It is a fact that character is formed through hardship, through overcoming obstacles, through enduring despite difficulties. I think our Christian ancestors demonstrate to us a faith that goes beyond words, a faith that is willing to endure persecution, even death if necessary, because they are so focused on the next life and on their faith. My friends, as Christians, we have the greatest hope that anyone could ever ask for. We're going home. We should be able to face anything in this life with the confidence that when it's over, we have something far better. It's time that we recognize that we invest in that, and when we sing these songs about heaven and when we talk about it, that we feel it, that we believe it, that we place our confidence in it. Many of you know Jimmy Adams, who attended here for many years, who is now shut in. I've been talking with her this past week, and she is pretty aggravated that she's still here. You guys ever talk to her about that? She will let you know, I can't believe I'm still alive. I'm ready to go. She was out trimming her bushes the other day and, 90-something years old. She's pretty distraught that she's still here. She's ready to go. Are we ready to go? Are we distraught that we're still hanging around? Obviously, we have a lot to live for here in this life, but let's not get so attached that we can't see the next. Let's have 2 feet on this earth and 2 eyes looking towards heaven, because that's our home. Maybe you're living a life that's not heavenly focused, and we need to help you with that. We want to pray with you. Or maybe you're not set on the path of righteousness. You're not headed toward that eternal home, and you need to put on Christ in baptism and make that commitment tonight. Don't leave this auditorium without getting your life right. Come now as we stand and as we sing.